Welcome once again to RocGrowth Candids. I'm your host, Diana Pilatus, and we are so glad that you are here because we have two wonderful entrepreneurs who are also reps of, as Richard said, the new generation transforming our region. Not to put too much pressure on you, but Jason Barrett and Glenn Kellogg. And Jason, of course, is the owner and head distiller of Black Button Distillery. It's the first craft distillery in Rochester since Prohibition. So thank goodness those days are over, right? At the age of just 24, when most of us were putting back a lot of gin and tonics, Jason started making gin and moonshine and bourbon. And 4 years later, he is now leading a staff of 7, produces nearly 1,500 bottles of spirits each week, and goes to 11 states and growing. And he runs a great still and bar in the Rochester Public Market neighborhood. So welcome to Jason Barrett.
Thank you for having me.
Glenn Kellogg also took a chance on a Rochester neighborhood, making a change. He is the president of Hart's Local Grocers, the new grocery store in downtown's East End. Glenn's company is called Rochester Local Capital, and his background is in urban economics and strategic planning, construction management, and small business development, all things you needed to get Hart's off the ground. From a concept to a reality with investors, employees, and customers. And Glenn's worked on other projects in Washington, D.C., Portland, Oregon, Memphis, Baltimore, and Buffalo. And thanks once again to both of you for being here. Okay, so the first question is, you've been a lot of places, you went away, why Rochester?
I mean, for me, it was predominantly because Rochester is home. I wanted to be closer to family. 24 is not a age where you're old necessarily, but I was starting to notice that if I was going to really settle down somewhere, I wanted it to be back where my home roots were. The other side of it was Rochester's a very food-smart community, evidenced by some of the other great local food entrepreneurs we have here. We've had wine in this community for a long time, with the Finger Lakes being nearby. Craft beer has been here for a long time, started by our landlord Rohrbox, and craft distilling was not yet present in the Rochester area, so it was a lot of fun to be the first. But even if we had been the second or third, I still think I would have been coming back to Rochester to do this. We definitely wanted to be at the public market. That was a key component of our business strategy. To me, that's sort of the epicenter of food in Rochester, and so to be making our products and serving them right outside the gates of the public market was sort of the original dream and what we ended up putting together.
Okay, what about you, Glenn? You came from the Washington, D.C. area.
The short answer is my wife brought me here. But the
Not
long
kicking and screaming, though,
no,
right? You were happy
no,
to be here.
actually, she thought I was crazy when I said that. Well, maybe this would be a good idea. So in most of my career has been in urban economics and traveling around the country, as you mentioned, working on master plans and neighborhood revitalization projects and comprehensive plans, doing the economic analysis that supports fixing cities. So after a while, it's rewarding work, and I still love doing it, but it's also sort of leaving a wet pile of consulting on somebody's doorstep and saying, good luck with that, and call me in 10 years and let me know how it goes. And I was increasingly interested in being involved in my own community. And we were living in Washington, D.C., and through one change of events after another, my wife left one job and started working consulting from home while she finished her PhD, and I have a home office. So our 2-bedroom condo in D.C. got really crowded really fast. And I talk on the phone all day. And she was writing a PhD, and she wanted to kill me. So we started thinking about where we could go that we could afford a whole house. And
each have an office, maybe.
And maybe each have an office. And that we could really get more involved in our community. DC is a big place. We were involved with our neighborhood, but it's Rochester has been really so welcoming. So we mapped our social networks. Really, we listed everyone we knew and where they lived. And couldn't get Rochester off the list because her family is deeply part of the community here. And so we finally said, okay, we've seen Rochester through holiday visits, but let's come up and give it a try. Look at the city outside of their window, and came up and visited other friends, and went out to Good Luck and Solera for drinks, and met a whole bunch of different people, and went to the places and said, yeah, you know what? There's some cool stuff here. This could really work. I can see us making a life here, and we've got friends here. Well, what kind of house could we afford to buy if we sold a 2-bedroom condo in D.C.? Oh, really? So
Now you have 3 offices, or 4.
we sold a 2-bedroom condo and bought a 6-bedroom house. So,
And I sold a 2-bedroom condo and bought a still.
Priorities, right? Whatever makes you happy. That's a.
DC housing prices are not favorable.
and so along with that was also, well, I'm an economics geek, and so as we were looking at that, I started to take a look at the market in Rochester and the demographics and what's going on here, and realized that there's regionally a pretty good economy here. And right next to downtown, there are these really solid neighborhoods with students and young professionals and young families that I've worked in so many other towns that would kill for those demographics adjacent to their downtown. And meanwhile, the city has also been pushing to get new residents living downtown. So I looked at all of this and said, okay, well, based on the disposable income of these kind of households, where are the services? And sort of looked around and scratched my head and said, they kind of don't exist. So we have to figure out why they don't exist. And it seemed to me there's a huge opportunity to start providing services for those residents who are already here and who are continuing to move in.
See a need, fill a need.
Yeah.
And that's what it came down to. So if you want to tell us, how did you take it from, okay, I'm moving back and I'm getting a distillery?
Well, actually, I decided I was going to do the distillery and then decided to move back. Part of it was laws. New York actually has some great distilling laws. About 8 years ago, about 9 years ago, actually, at this point, some entrepreneurs down in the Hudson Valley convinced the state of New York to wholesale rewrite the liquor laws for production of alcohol. 10 years ago, if you'd wanted to make a drop of gin, it would have been $60,000 a year, hundreds of thousands of dollars of bonds, and it would not have been economically viable at a small business size. But 9 years ago, I have to update my stories. But 9 years ago, they passed the farm distilling law, basically copied 6 sections of law from Oregon. And what that said was that if you were going to use New York State agricultural products, you could start a farm distillery. The licensing was considerably less, $1,500 a year. That's a number I can work with. You could have a tasting room. You could sell directly to bars and restaurants, skipping the wholesalers. They made it very economically viable to have a small business. New York is generally considered to have the 3rd best laws in the country for distilling. Consequently, we also have the 3rd largest number of distilleries in the state. So the legal side of it definitely was a large portion of it. And then a part of it was, again, that interest in the food community. I was watching Rochester kind of go through this transition. Craft breweries were just starting to open in the wave that we're now going through with them. And I really saw the opportunity to bring craft distilling that I was witnessing out on the West Coast here to Rochester. So that's that, family, laws that made it economically viable. Because I did actually write a business plan to start a distillery in D.C., which had me sitting in like a garage with like a 55-gallon drum, a little different than what we were able to put up here. So
That would have been a great picture, though.
you can just picture me in a garage with a 55-gallon drum.
And so was there another brand that you were inspired by? Why distilling? What?
Well, it's a slightly longer story than that, but I'll try to keep it brief. So I actually went to SUNY Cortland, got a political science degree, was studying Prohibition and the Volstead Act, and came to realize that although I couldn't buy beer at the age of 19, I could make beer. So I actually started making alcohol in my dorm room.
Oh my! See, this
At
is why you
19.
ask those questions.
Not drinking it, of course, because that would be a problem.
Just selling it.
But my friends and I all thought this was a great endeavor. When I moved to DC, I kept that up as a hobby. DC has a very vibrant homebrewers community, probably about the size that the Rochester homebrewers community is today. But this was a number of years ago before that community really had started to flourish. And I was originally actually going to open a brewery. I was very inspired by some of the brewing brands that had gotten started. And I was an accountant, so I was able to get clients that were breweries. And the more I learned about the back end of the story, the economics of it, the business side of it, the more I loved it. And then because my accounting firm didn't have anyone specializing in distilleries, when we picked up a distillery client, they assigned it to me. And all of a sudden, my distillery client noticed that every time they called to have a question, I was like, that's really something we could better discuss in person. I will see you tomorrow. And they noticed that they literally couldn't call without me coming to answer the question in person, which was just an excuse to get out of the office and go see the distillery. In getting to know them, getting to know the background of the business, it was actually interesting. Once I realized that all the skills and things I loved about making beer could be translated into making bourbon, I actually never made beer again. Not on purpose, I just converted the equipment to doing something else. And therefore really just kind of switched from beer to bourbon. I'd always been a big fan of drinking bourbon. It was kind of a light bulb moment when I got that customer. I didn't actually realize you could make bourbon. And I still get plenty of people that are like, wait a minute, you make bourbon? Well, somebody does. Doesn't grow on trees. Barrels do, but...
And maybe after you'll share some of those recipes of how you do that, right? How it doesn't grow on trees and how the process and all that stuff.
Be happy to walk you through the
yes,
process.
please. So, Glenn, how did it get to be that you decided there was a need for this grocery store downtown, and then how did you go about that? Because you really had he had state laws and you had state and local and really revitalizing a neighborhood there.
Yeah, the legal side wasn't really my first concern. Revitalizing a downtown and looking at the services that were missing and the opportunities for providing businesses was really the impetus for it. And there were actually a couple of other businesses that I tried to get going before this that just didn't get traction, and we just had to walk away, and this was the first project that had teeth, and we went with it. So wrote a business plan, did a lot of research on that, started searching for other companies that might be able to help run it, realized in the process that there was no one in the region who, and the reason that there wasn't competition in downtown was that nobody in the region knows how to do a downtown grocery store. And Rochester doesn't have a reputation outside of the region to attract, at least at the time, didn't have the reputation to attract people who did know how to do that. So we figured we'd copy the people who knew what they were doing and copy their business plans and started finding people with the skills to come in and run the business.
It had been a while because Wegmans used to have a place in Midtown, but you decided to put it back where there was a store many years ago.
It's not exactly where there was a store many years ago, but Hart's, well, we used to buy groceries in a really different way. In the lobby of Hart's, when you walk in, we have a map of all of the original Hart's grocery stores in town. In case you don't know, Hart's is a local brand that was started really in the late 1800s by Moses Hart and was expanded by his son Alfred Hart, such that by the 1930s they were on almost literally every street corner. They were smaller. They were small grocery stores, 2 to 5,000 square feet. But that's where the entire neighborhood would get their groceries. Before you piled your groceries into a car and drove 5 miles, when you were walking with your groceries, you were going to buy a smaller amount and walk down the street. So it was a really different model based on
You didn't
land
have
use
the
and
place to
transportation.
store it. You didn't have refrigerators the way we have them today. You didn't go shopping every 2 weeks. You went almost every day. So it was a very different way of doing it.
So there were over 100 stores in Rochester, 100 Hart's locations in Rochester in the 1930s. The brand, some of you may remember Star Market in Rochester. Hart's, when Alfred Hart died, his manager assumed the business and slowly began converting Hart's into the more modern Star Market. And so consequently, years later, that was bought by a conglomerate and then went out of business, and the Hart's name was still available. And although some of the Hart's family are still around in town, he had 3 daughters, so they didn't assume the business, and the Hart's last name is not as prevalent, but the family is still in town. They're very, very proud of what we've done.
So they come in and say
They
hello,
do.
and
Yes.
that's cool. Now you had to go and you redid this building. Talk about that and
Oh.
how you knew all those ways of doing that because of your background. And
Well, we didn't anticipate buying a building. The plan really was to start a grocery store. And we went through a couple of locations with developers and plans that fell through. And this opportunity came up. The building wasn't on the market. It wasn't for sale, or it wasn't for sale, and the owner was not interested in renting it. So we had to come up with additional money to buy the building and manage that as well. So our equity company came up with a separate company to own and manage the building and renovate it, so that we could make this happen.
you too went into a very historic place, and Rohrbox owns the building, right?
So
you're still near
Rohrbox-
beer.
Rohrbox does own the building. We had sort of an interesting curveball thrown our way as well, though. We were going to be on Railroad Street where we are today, but we were going to be across the street. And at the last moment, the deal fell through because that landlord was trying to sell the building. And you can't really move distilleries. Again, big federal regulations and laws, as well as a lot of custom equipment. And so we weren't able to sign a lease with that individual. But we had already lined up all of our licensing, all of our financing, and we really kind of needed to move fairly quickly. And so on a Friday, I had found out we weren't going to be signing this lease. And on Saturday, I already had an appointment with John Erleb, the owner of Rohrbox, just to introduce myself. I just didn't want, if we're going to make spirits across the street, I didn't want the brewery that's been there for a long time to read about us in the paper. I wanted to introduce myself. And so I go over to see him, and I started off with, well, we were going to be neighbors, but I guess not. And I'm going to have to find somewhere else to go because I need to rent about 5,000 square feet, and there isn't any square footage available on Railroad Street. And he goes, well, technically no, but let me show you something. And we walked into the space that is now Black Button, and none of the walls existed. The floor wasn't there. It was literally a dirt floor. It had just been this storage area with busted kegs and broken glass and equipment that they hadn't bothered to deal with over the years. And no water, no lights, no electric. And we're standing there at the back door, and he goes, I mean, it's 5,000 square feet. If you're not afraid to renovate it, I don't know, what were you going to pay across the street? I tell him what the rent was going to be across the street, and he goes, sure, that'll work. And we shook hands and had papers drawn up and started the process a couple weeks after that. What was an interesting curveball was we had not planned to renovate a building. We had planned to move into one. And so that dramatically affected the business plan during our initial construction. The folks at Rohrbox were nice enough to also contribute a very large amount of money to getting that space ready to looking like it is today. So actually what started out as sort of a problem turned into a real blessing. We have a fully modern distillery in a historic building. So we got to end up laying out all the floor drains, all of our utilities exactly the way we would have wanted to. We then just had to pay to put them in, so that was tough.
Was like for you too?
It was. We were hoping that our building that used to be a auto garage would be a good fit for a grocery store because the auto shop needed big open space to drive cars into, and a grocery store needs big open space that you can put shelves in. But the auto shop also needed a grade to drain things into a drain, and when you take a shopping cart on it, didn't work so well. So we ended up having to redo the entire floor and do a lot more work than we wanted to. But at the same time, it meant that all of our drains went in the right places, and we were able to put everything where we wanted.
In it, like I said.
But yeah, it
into
was a lot. The whole having to renovate the building ourselves was a lot more expensive and really threw us a curveball. Yeah.
Nice to have them both still in our midst. The funding. I mean, that's our biggest question. I think most of us want to know. You want to get a business. You both did it differently. Can you tell us how you did it, Jason?
Sure. So our funding, we're 100% family owned. We don't have any outside investors. We've had opportunities to take on equity investors, but as an accountant down in DC, I watched some very prominent restaurants that were clients of mine really struggle with partnership arrangements and running the restaurant with different partners having different priorities. And so when one of the goals of Black Button was to have it just be, myself, just run it myself. I had done very well at the accounting company that I had worked at. They paid by the billable hour, and you got time and a half for overtime, a lot of overtime. And then I did sell my house that had been a fixer-upper, so I was able to save some money from that. That money combined with a bank loan from M&T Bank to buy the equipment. For us, there's a lot of hard assets. There's stills and fermentation tanks and forklifts and physical items that, as my banker likes to point out to me, if we fail, she can sell to someone else. We have actually taken on a new round of debt each of the last 3 years. We're hoping to not take on a round of debt this year, but the company is financed through debt and through my personal endeavors. And at the moment, we're hoping to stay 100% owned that way. So,
Glenn, you want to tell us how you did?
Sure. My company, Rochester Local Capital, is backed by similarly family and friends who seem to think that investing in this kind of stuff was a good idea. But we were initially interested in putting in about 25% and then getting community members to fund the rest of it. And
You were a little ahead of your time, weren't you?
Yes, I was a couple years.
Not crowdfunding, but crowdfunded.
Well, what I really wanted to do was crowdfunding. I really did want to put this out for crowdfunding and be able to let the community invest in local businesses. So I was a little bit early because I was planning this in 2012. I don't know how familiar all of you are with the crowdfunding acts, but the Jobs Act of 2012 was really important for this and opened the gates for crowdfunding for businesses like this. And I was thinking, great, this is going to be wonderful. And then the SEC sat on it and didn't produce guidelines. Really, accredited investors were approved very quickly, but it's only I think in January or at the end of last year that they approved like the Title III, allowing anyone to crowdfund, and that's still not even implemented yet. It becomes implemented later this year. So I was hoping that would be the road that we'd go, but we needed to get moving. And so I ended up going the old-fashioned route of word of mouth, friends of friends, knocking on doors, took a lot of people to dinner, had a lot of coffees, a lot of drinks, pitching the business plan.
Well, you're just going to have to do another business where you could do it crowdfunded, right? And that's the way it goes. Gentlemen, go ahead.
And actually, I would be remiss. There was one more portion of ours. We did run a Kickstarter campaign for tangible items, T-shirts, sweatshirts. We initially had intended to kind of pre-sell bottles, although 2 weeks before we launched our Kickstarter campaign, Kickstarter changed the rules where alcohol could not be one of the rewards, which kind of sucks when you're gonna make alcohol, because that's what people and all the emails we were getting were like, why can't I subscribe for a bottle of gin? Well, because that would now be illegal. But we did raise $27,000 from the community to help us buy the original set of whiskey barrels, because with that build out and changing of the economics of our very first year, we had to tap the money we had intended to invest in whiskey. And we replaced that money with the Kickstarter funds. So,
well, one question before we take questions from the audience, because we really want you to ask these guys what you need to know. If you wrote a book about about everything you learned in business, what would the title be? And I did give you guys a little heads up on this, didn't I?
You did, but I spent most of the last 3 days making whiskey, so.
So we should get some really creative answers here, Jason. Come on.
Why? Do I look like I know what I'm doing?
Good one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, it is kind of fun. Fake it till you make it. I mean, like, it is interesting sitting there talking to large distributors, or even, hopefully my bank's not in the room, talking to the bank, and they're like, so talk to us about this. And you're like, yeah, this is definitely what's going to happen next quarter.
Fake it till you make it. Maybe you guys could join together on that. But thank you so much for joining together here today. We really appreciate it.